I think that's the crux of it. I mean, when you look at the region, most of the population is more than 50% of the population is under 25, and there aren't even education doesn't really prepare them very much for private sector jobs. So you need to create more private sector jobs. You need to create more jobs in the sort of knowledge economy, which we're very weak on as well in this part of the world. But I think the wonderful thing that's come out of the revolutions in Tunisia and Egypt is that the youth in the Arab world now have heroes to look up to, and it's not Al-Qaeda. Mm-hmm. You know, if you are given a role model like the Egyptian youth in Tahrir Square, or even I mean, Libya is a youth-led movement as well, then, you know, if you have a choice of going out, making change peacefully, and then building yourself a better future, or blowing yourself up, you know, you're going to go the other way.
Is that why the example of Mohammed Bouazizi was so captured so many people's imagination, because they could relate to that story? To be educated but not to have the opportunities that you want.
Look at a country like Syria, 40% the unemployment rate up to the age of 35. Look at also many other countries in Egypt and many places. I think economics issue is quite important. Unemployment is a key issue. Fairness, justice, transparency. I mean, they're just asking for legitimate things. They're not asking...
Where are the jobs going to come from, though? I mean, it's different here. This is an oil economy. Syria is not an oil economy. Yeah. Egypt's not an oil economy. Huge population. I mean, that's where the jobs, especially given Egypt's position of leadership in the Arab world, the jobs have got to come from somewhere, haven't they?
Well, it's a very complicated story in Egypt, particularly because of the number of population, also in some of the other Arab countries. But if you have a legitimate elected government by the people, at least the people will have their own saying, contribute to the solution that they may find it important. At the same time, reduce the corruption and change the situation to something where they can contribute and participate in that decision, look into their economy and find. I mean, Egypt has a great land, it can be a great agricultural producer. We are a huge net importer of so many things.
So it has potential.
Oh, it has potential. Each one of the countries has a great potential. It has not been just addressed properly. I mean, Tunis, between tourism and olive oil, that's the biggest part of the economy in Egypt.
But this education question is at the core of a lot of this, isn't it? I mean, one of the things that's also been very, very impressive as an outsider is to see all these young Arab men and women bilingual, trilingual, explaining to people what they want and doing so in a very clear, direct way. It's been quite extraordinary.
I mean, you ask where the jobs are going to come from, and they're going to come from people who are ready for the 21st century. And countries like the UAE have worked on, I mean, we all criticize and there's things to improve, but basically they've produced an educational system where people are globally aware. English, IT, and not embarrassed about being themselves. Whereas you have the Saudi Minister of Water and Electricity coming saying, unfortunately, we have too many people who are Quranic exegetists and not enough water engineers. So the education provides the people who are going to move forward into the knowledge economy of the future.
And do you think most young people get that, or at least get that here?
It entirely depends what the government's been doing for the last 30 years in the Ministry of Education. If you give it to the Wahhabi establishment, you have a problem. If you give it to professional educationalists, you're 2 steps ahead.
Hassan, where do you think outsiders feature in all this? Because it is very interesting. Abdulaziz was saying, you know, we've not seen American flags being burned. We've not seen Israeli flags being burned. There are other issues perhaps that we need to address, but this is internal to the Arab world. So in that sense, do you think outsiders really have much of a role that they can play?
I think they have a role in, number one, keeping others at bay, keeping it and sort of clearing the field so that this can play out, number one. Number two, I think that they need to support the creation or support the cultivation of nascent forms of institutions. One of the most dangerous things that maybe the word dangerous is not right, but one of the most important things that you face now are there aren't enough institutions to support democracy. You may be able to have a vote, but that's not necessarily democracy.
Not the same.
Exactly.
But I mean, that was an interesting point about Libya. I mean, once you get rid of the Gaddafis, assuming they're on their way out, what do you have left of a civil society?
What supports civil society, and then in turn, what supports a democracy?
But that's very different. Egypt has got many institutions. Syria has got many institutions, despite their past. So again, it's different in different places.
I think Egypt is a bellwether. I think where Egypt goes will determine whether this entire Arab Spring is successful or not, and whether it actually puts us on a proper course source for the region, or whether it goes in a different direction.
Okay, the other thing the outside world is very interested in is, of course, the price of oil, which we're paying greatly for at the moment. I mean, how significant is that going to be? Because you write about that all the time. I mean, do you see the price of oil certainly being $115 a barrel and more?
It's gone up, and I think the market was bullish anyway, and I think we saw this spike up when Egypt started because people were worried about access through the Suez Canal, and it went up even more. Now the question is, you know, when can Libya come back? At what rate can Libya come back? And if you look at history, every oil price spike has actually been related to events in the Middle East, whether it's the Islamic Revolution in Iran, the oil embargo, the Middle East wars, and it's we're relying too much now on one country, which is Saudi Arabia, to make up for the loss from Libya. So your spare capacity is very, very thin at the moment. So it couldn't support another disruption, be it by, natural disaster or political upheaval. So I think the market is on edge, and that's being reflected. Plus, the risk factor is very, very fair, has been multiplied. But of course, that's also creating fears of stagflation, which is, slow economic growth, higher prices. We've seen higher food prices, commodities across the board, metals, gold, as a safe haven. And what the countries in the region are doing is they're not really going to benefit fully. They will make maybe $1 trillion in oil revenue this year, according to the IEA, but they're throwing it at their people, not necessarily in the right places, not necessarily in education perhaps, but Saudi Arabia is throwing billions.
Of unrest, basically.
To ward off the potential of unrest, giving handouts basically to the people. But it's only Band-Aid. It's not going to be enough to fix the structural changes that you have to fix for a sort of future society.
The other big giant in all this that we've touched on very briefly is Iran itself and Iran's role, because the whole question of the future of Iran has got actually quite similar problems to Arab countries in terms of, quite educated young people who feel they haven't got enough opportunities. Iranians, like Arabs, can do well almost everywhere, but sometimes not in their home country. I mean, how do you think that's going to play out in terms of Iran's relationship with the rest of the Gulf?
Well, we have witnessed a very serious move this week. Kuwait have decided to leave the diplomat to leave Kuwait, and also Bahrain have called their ambassadors, and Kuwait they called their ambassador. There is a great tension here because it has been seen that strong Iranian intervention in the domestic politics of the region by escalating the sectarian issue there and bringing and moving
Sunni Shia,
the Sunni Shia issues and so on, that one. So I think this is an important dimension. I think at the same time we don't believe, I mean, the Iranians, they may benefit of higher oil prices now to bring an additional cushion for the domestic issue, but at the same time we think the reformist movement in Iran will continue, and they will be affected on the medium and long term also by what's happening in the Arab world. There's a snowball effect, we will see it in different places and so, but somehow the events taking place in the Arab world is much more faster than what's happening in Iran. So the Iranian wanted to get an advantage by that, and we have heard them saying this is an extension of the Islamic Revolution there, which is not true. This is why, as I said before, we have not seen a green flag.
It's wishful thinking, perhaps.
And we have not seen, that American-Israeli flag being burned. So it's very much driven by the domestic issue. If I may just a little point in the education, I think, like Kate said, the government in the region will spend massively also in the education. I think this awareness is there since we are in an education institution here. A country like Saudi Arabia now, they spend 27% of their budget in education. They have more than 120,000 students studying outside. Perhaps 20,000 of them only in UK and about 30,000 in the US. So there is a lot of awareness and a huge number of doctors studying in Canada, more than 4,000.
Just from Saudi Arabia?
Just from Saudi Arabia.
But that's going to change Saudi Arabia, isn't it?
That will help.
These people come back.
Oh yes, when these people, they come back with better education, with more 21st century knowledge, it will help a lot to change even the current domestic education, which is under the process. They're looking at the modernization of the program, particularly in mathematics and science and so, because they realize that's important. We've seen now an important program on the issues of modern school, using more technology, changing the curriculum, allocating a special budget for the modernization of the whole education system, and more university. Now we have 25 university, more than 1 million students at the Saudi university domestically.
But I mean, the pace of change in Saudi Arabia has been glacially slow, hasn't it?
Yes. There was expectations of the day of rage. It didn't happen, and it doesn't look as though it's going to be very much reformed there very quickly.
I introduced the subject of Iran just in the
Yes.
last couple of minutes. I'd like to talk just a little bit more about that. I mean, how do you see that playing out? Because I know from Iranians that they say both those who wish for reform and those who wish to stop reform in Iran are looking very carefully at how, for example, Libya is being handled.
Well, the whole Arab world watched the Green Revolution a year ago, and you had this sophisticated discussion between Ahmadinejad's government and the opposition, discussing even the nature of what the supreme leader was about. There was a big constitutional discussion. Didn't go anywhere, but the Arab world said, "My God, these guys can talk." Now suddenly, Iran is looking to the Arab world, saying these guys have moved ahead. But on the oil price, Ahmadinejad's now got a decent oil price, and he can keep funding his government for a very long way. I think he's pretty secure.
Which means he can stay in power, he can be secure. It's a very complicated country, Iran.
Well, he has 2 years to the election, doesn't he? You know, I wouldn't be so sanguine about the direction. I think that Iran has huge challenges and that they're facing right now. And just as important, I think that with the Arab Spring, you know, the entire attraction to Iran and what's been happening over the past, say, 5-6 years has sort of been dissolved. I mean, it no longer has the attraction that it may have had before to young Arabs who now see it in-house. They have the revolutions on their soil,
other models,
and they're speaking in Arabic, and they're doing it in their own way.
That is quite important, isn't it? I mean, because you introduced the thought that there are models here for change in the Arab world itself, and that's really important.
Yes, but I don't think Iran, I mean, don't forget, Iran is under sanctions, international sanctions, EU, UN, US, you name it. They're not getting as much foreign investment. In fact, they're getting hardly any at all. The only ones that are operating there are the Chinese, maybe some Malaysian companies. And they are needing to fund a lot of their own projects. So the high oil price is going to be poured into they have to maintain their production because they still rely very heavily on oil. But in Iran, you don't really have public opinion because you're under sanctions, because you're isolated. It was a bit like Iraq. Saddam was able to consolidate his power because he was under sanctions. So they can repress, they can stamp down on the opposition and not allow it to happen. But I don't think they're in such a great position. If there's turmoil in Syria, Syria is their only real ally in the region. You've got the whole axis of Hezbollah, Syria, Hezbollah in Lebanon, Syria, and Iran. So I think that's also going to be key as to how much of a role Iran can play in the region.
We'll leave it there, Kate, because that's all for this special edition from Dateline from Dubai at the Men's College here in the Gulf. Our thanks to our hosts at the Higher Colleges of Technology. We'll be back in London next week. Goodbye.